A starving woman walked onto a dying Wyoming ranch in the summer of 1883, carrying nothing but a small lacquered box. The rancher had nothing left to give her but a meal and a joke about sushi he never expected her to answer. There was no seaweed within 1,000 miles of that territory, and the land itself was bleeding white from years of hard use. What she did with an iron pan and a few eggs would silence a crew that had written her off before she said a word. Stay until the end to see how one question asked as a joke won a harvest and changed both their lives. And if it moves you, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The Bar R sat in a basin of blown grass and gray dirt, and by the first week of July, it was running out of both. Remington Cole stood on the porch and counted what he had left the way a man counts coins he already knows are short. 3 sections of fence were down. The south field was too cracked to plant. A banknote was coming due the week of the first frost. The crew ate beans and hard bread twice a day because there was nothing else to give them, and the cattle had thinned to ribs and bad temper. He was 34 and looked older, the kind of worn that comes not from years but from losing a little ground every season until the ground itself seems to be against you. His father had run this place the hard way, the same crop in the same rows until the rows gave out. He died leaving the ranch to a son and a soil that were both about used up. The bank in town had carried the note for 2 seasons out of patience and not out of kindness. The man at the bank had told Remington in the flat tone of a man reading from a ledger that the 3rd season was the last one the paper would wait. Remington wrote no answer to that. He told no one on the crew because a rancher who admits the clock to his men has already lost them. He carried the date the way she would later carry the box, close and quiet and against the ribs. She came up the road just past noon, when the heat made the dust hang in the air like a held breath. She was small-framed, thin in a way that spoke of hunger rather than delicacy. Her jet-black hair was pinned in a traditional Japanese knot, and her almond-shaped dark eyes didn't flinch from the men who stopped working to stare. She wore a faded kimono beneath a dust-coated trail coat, the silk of it wrong for this country in every possible way, and she carried a small lacquered wooden box against her ribs, like a thing she wouldn't let the road take. Her skin was fair against the dust, her cheekbones high and sharp, and she walked with the stillness of someone who had already decided what she would do before she arrived. She stopped at the porch and didn't beg. The foreman, a thick man named Webb, was the first to speak, and he spoke to Remington rather than to her, the way you might speak about a stray dog that had wandered into a yard. "We don't need anything here." She answered him anyway, her voice low and careful with the weight of a language she had learned late. She had crossed an ocean, she said, and she had walked a long way, and she was asking for work, not for a handout. Men like Webb didn't know the difference between a Chinese woman and a Japanese one, and they didn't care to, and the distinction she offered them was lost on every face in the yard. To them, she was only the foreign woman, wrong-colored and wrong-dressed, standing where she didn't belong, and the wrongness of her was the only thing about her they could all agree on. Remington looked at the box, then at her hands, which were clean and steady, and had the look of hands that knew how to do a thing or two. He had no room for another mouth, and less room for the trouble she would bring. But he had eaten nothing himself that morning, and he recognized the particular set of a person who has stopped expecting kindness. He told her she could have a meal for a day's work, and that if the day's work didn't amount to anything, the road was still right there behind her. She nodded once, the kind of nod that is an answer and a contract at the same time, and she set the lacquered box down on the porch rail without opening it. One of the older hands, a man named Dobbs who had been on the Bar R longer than the fence posts, nodded at the box and asked her plain what she had in there. She didn't answer him. She didn't move the box. The not answering was its own kind of statement, the kind that plants a question in a yard and leaves it there to do its work. Webb spat in the dirt and walked away, and the crew went back to the fence they wouldn't finish. The box sat there closed between them all, like a question no one had asked yet, and no one had been given permission to open. Morning came hard, the way it does on a ranch that is losing, and Remington needed a reason to keep her, or a reason to send her walking before the crew decided the question for him. The cook, a man named Bates, had been sick 3 days with a fever that smelled like it would last the week, and the kitchen was the one corner of the place that still ran on habit, so he put her there with what there was. There was a sack of rice from the general store, a basket of eggs from the hen house, some dried fish, and a few vegetables gone soft in the cellar. He told her to feed the hands at noon, and he said it the way a man says something he expects to fail. He was half out the door when he turned back, tired and dry in the voice, and asked it as a joke. "Can you make sushi?" He didn't expect an answer, and he didn't expect the answer he got, which wasn't words at all. She looked at him and gave a single small nod, then asked him one question in return, quiet and plain, about what food he had in the house. He listed it, the rice, the eggs, the fish, the sad vegetables, and he watched her face the way you watch weather you cannot read, looking for the break that would tell him she had no idea what she was doing. The break didn't come. She asked for an iron pan, a little sugar if there was any, the rice, and an hour, and he gave it to her because it cost him nothing and because he had already used up his suspicion on bigger problems. The crew drifted toward the kitchen doorway as the morning went on, drawn less by hunger than by the chance to watch a stranger make a fool of herself. They leaned in the frame and made the kind of low talk men make when they're sure of the outcome, betting she couldn't make anything worth eating out of a sack of rice and a few eggs. Dobbs allowed that he had eaten fish rolled in rice once, in a port town a long time ago, and that it had been wrapped in something dark and flat that he couldn't name. The men agreed that whatever that was, it wasn't in this kitchen. Through the doorway, they could see the lacquered box sitting on the table where she had set it, closed, and they wondered about it the way men wonder about anything locked. But she didn't open it, and she didn't explain it. She worked with her back to them and her hands steady, and the kitchen filled with a smell none of them had a name for, warm rice and something sweet browning in a pan, and the bedding got quieter as the smell got stronger. She reached for the seaweed first, by habit, the way a hand reaches for a tool it has used 10,000 times. There was nothing there but the bare board where seaweed would have been if this had been any kitchen she had ever known. She stood still with that for a moment, the kind of stillness that isn't defeat, but calculation, and the crew in the doorway took it for the break they had been waiting for. The nearest coast was a continent away, and there was no nori on a frontier ranch, no shop, no shipment, no neighbor who might have a strip of it in a jar. A lesser cook would have quit the room right there, and half of them expected her to. She turned back to the eggs and the iron pan and the small dish of sugar Remington had found for her, and she began. She beat the eggs with a little sugar and a pinch of salt, nothing more, and she poured a thin sheet of it into the hot pan so it spread flat and pale gold across the iron, almost translucent. It cooked in the time it takes to draw one slow breath. The hiss of egg on hot metal cut the silence in the room, and the smell of it rose warm and sweet and strange against the dust and the beans that had been the whole smell of the place for weeks. She lifted the crepe free with her fingers, quick and sure, and laid it flat on the board. She spread a layer of seasoned rice across it in a thin, even field, then laid down strips of the dried fish and a few pickled vegetables cut fine from the cellar stock. She rolled it tight the way her grandmother had rolled it in a kitchen an ocean and a lifetime away. She cut it into clean rounds with a knife so sharp the cuts left no ragged edge, the egg crepe bright against the white rice and the dark fish inside it. It was golden on the plate, like something that had no business being in this kitchen and was there anyway. The first plate went out to the table, and the men looked at it before they looked at each other. The youngest hand picked one up first, more dare than appetite, and he bit into it and went quiet in a way that made the others lean forward. "What is this?" He said it flat, not as a question, but as a man trying to find a drawer to put a thing in, and nobody answered him because nobody had a name for it that would fit this country. Then a second man reached, and a third, and the sound in the room changed from the low talk of men waiting for failure to the sound of men eating something they hadn't expected to find in this country, in this life. Nobody spoke for a long minute. The silence was its own kind of verdict, the kind that doesn't need a word to make it stick. When the plate was empty, the youngest pushed it forward across the table. A small motion, the first crack in the suspicion that had been the whole of their feeling toward her since she walked up the road. She didn't smile at it, and she didn't take it as praise. She only began the second crepe, pouring the egg thin and lifting it free, and spreading the rice with the same steady hand, and the kitchen stayed full of men who had come to watch her fail and had stayed to wait for more. The amber lantern threw its flickering light across the gold of the crepe and the steam off the rice. The room that had smelled of beans for a month smelled like a different country, and they ate it and didn't know the name of what they were eating and didn't need to. By evening, the talk about the meal had changed in a way that had nothing to do with the meal itself. The hands sat on the porch and the corral rails and spoke of her without the mockery that had been there in the morning. Not with warmth yet, but with the grudging tone men use when they've been proven wrong and aren't ready to say so plainly. Webb was the last holdout, the kind of man who trusts nothing he cannot break, and he watched her clear the table and wipe the board and stack the crockery with the same steady hands. He gave her the only kind of compliment he had in him. "You earned your keep today." It wasn't much, but it was the first time anyone on the Bar R had spoken to her as a worker rather than as a problem, and she took it the way she took everything, with a nod and no extra word. Remington stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched the steam come off the last pot, the amber light of the kerosene lantern catching the gold of an egg crepe she had set aside for the morning. He watched her the way the thumbnail of this story caught him, from the doorway, not speaking. Something passed between them in that look that wasn't love and not even trust, but a recognition. Two people who had both learned what it costs to stand alone against a thing bigger than yourself. The recognition was enough to change the air in the room without changing a single word of it. A hand asked her later, in the blunt way the frontier allows, whether she was China or Japan, and the gap between what he assumed and what was true opened for a moment and then closed again without anyone needing to fill it. She answered him in 2 words, and he nodded as if the names were the same to him, and the small wrongness of it sat in the air and was left there. Correcting it would have cost more than it was worth, and she had bigger things to spend her voice on. She asked Remington if she could stay through the season in exchange for the kitchen and a corner to sleep in, and he agreed, but on the terms a man in his spot has to set. No wages until the place turned, just the kitchen and a cot and her keep, and nothing more until there was more to give. She took the terms the way she took the nod the day before, as a contract she had already decided to sign. The banknote and the gray Southfield were still sitting where he had left them that morning, and a meal, even a meal that silenced a crew, doesn't fix dirt. The kitchen had been solved, and solving it had only thrown the real problem into harder relief, because a ranch is not a kitchen, and a crew will not eat forever off the memory of one good meal. The Southfield was the enemy now, cracked and gray and powdered on top like ash, the corn that had been planted there stunted to knee height and yellow at the tips, the hay thin enough to see the dirt through. Remington had been working that ground the way his father had worked it before him, the same crop in the same rows year after year until the soil had nothing left to give and started taking back. The land had gone from tired to dying in the 3 seasons since the old man died. He could see it from the porch every morning, the field that had once fed the place now looking like it needed feeding itself, and the seeing of it had become a thing he didn't let himself do for long. She walked the fields at dawn before anyone was up, and Remington saw her from the porch, a small, dark figure moving slow along the rows, kneeling now and then to rub the dirt between her fingers the way she had rubbed the rice between hers the day before. He watched her read the ground the way she had read the kitchen, by what was there and what was missing, and he understood that she wasn't lost out there but working, even if the work looked like nothing to a man raised to measure work by sweat. She came back to the porch with dirt on her knees and told him, plain and without softening, that the soil wasn't dead, it was starved, and there was a difference, and the difference was the whole question. A dead field you abandon, she told him, and a starved field you feed, and the food it needed wasn't fertilizer from a shop, but the kind of planting that puts life back into the ground while it grows. Before he could answer, a rider came up the road, and the rider was the kind of problem that doesn't wait for a man to finish his morning. Harlan Pratt owned the spread to the east, 3 times the size of the Bar R, and rising while the Bar R fell, and he rode up on a polished horse with an offer in his pocket and the smell of it on him. He wanted the place, and he wanted it cheap, and he made the offer low enough to be an insult and high enough to be a kindness. He told Remington he would hold the number till the first hard frost, after which the bank would hold it instead. Remington said no with his jaw and nothing else, and Harlan rode away easy in the saddle, the ease of a man who knows that time is doing his work for him. She told Remington then what she would do, and she told him in the short, clear way of someone who has done the math and isn't asking permission. Legumes in the spent field to put the life back into the dirt, root crops to break the hard pan open, and the worst field left alone to rest, because ground that has been bled white sometimes needs nothing more than to be left alone. She didn't lecture him, and she didn't promise a miracle. She only told him what the old way was and why it worked. The beans and peas pulled nitrogen out of the air and fixed it into the soil through their roots, the roots opening the ground so the next crop could reach deeper. The rest let the dirt come back to itself, the way a body does after a long sickness. The frost was the wall they had to beat, his frost and Harlan's frost and the bank's frost, all the same frost. He looked at the dirt on her knees and the calm on her face, and he decided to bet his land on it. Not because he was sure, but because the road behind her was the only other choice he had. A plan was no good without seed to plant and food to carry the crew through the weeks the plan would take to prove itself. She turned to the second thing her hands knew how to do, the keeping of food through a hard season. She went through the ranch stores the same morning, the sacks of rice and grain stacked wrong in the cellar, open to the damp and the mice, half of what should have been there already ruined by the way it had been stored. She showed the cook how to dry the rice and grain first, and then pack it tight in the wooden containers the ranch already had, lined and covered with rice straw wrapping to keep the moisture out and the pests away. It was the way it had been done in the kitchen she came from, for longer than anyone could count. Bates, back on his feet and grudgingly impressed, watched her pack a barrel and admitted that he had been losing a quarter of every sack to spoilage, and hadn't known there was a fix for it that didn't come out of a bottle. Then she opened the lacquered box, and the room went quiet for a different reason than it had gone quiet over the sushi. The men had been guessing about that box since she walked up the road. Gold, maybe, or papers, or some secret worth hiding from a whole territory. And what she lifted out of it was none of those things. Inside were a set of small wooden measures worn smooth with use, a short knife her grandmother had kept for cutting clean, and a bundle of cloth. She unfolded it to show the seed inside, beans and peas, and the small hard seeds of a legume she had carried across the ocean and the whole walk since. The crew looked at it and saw no treasure, and the absence of treasure was itself a kind of answer. The kind that earns a quieter and more permanent respect than gold would have. A person who carries a farmer's kit across an ocean is telling you what they are before they ever say a word about it. Webb picked up one of the wooden measures and turned it in his hand, and he didn't laugh at it, which was the closest thing to acceptance the man had in him. The young hand who had eaten the first piece of sushi asked her to show him how she folded the egg crepe. That evening, in the amber lantern light, she did, slow and patient, the first thing she taught that wasn't about survival, but about sharing a way of doing. He burned the first one and laughed at himself for it, and she let him try again, and the small, warm sound of it was the first breathing room the ranch had taken in a long time, a beat of human noise between two stretches of hard. The box sat open on the table, and the seed was laid out to be sorted. And for the first time since she arrived, she looked like a woman who had stopped carrying the whole weight of where she had come from on her shoulders alone. The seed would go into the ground in the morning, and the ground would have to answer it, and the answering was the part no kitchen skill and no wooden box could guarantee. The rotation went into the ground that week, legumes in the spent south field where the corn had starved, root crops in the hard pan by the creek. The worst field was fenced off to rest for the season, with nothing planted in it at all. The crew worked it because they had eaten her food, and because hands that have been fed by a person will follow that person into dirt they wouldn't follow another man into, and the planting went faster than Remington had any right to expect. She worked beside them without making a show of it, her kimono tied up out of the dirt, and her hands as dark as theirs by noon, and the crew stopped noticing the strange of her and started noticing the sure. She set the legume rows the way her grandmother had set them, wide enough to let the roots breathe, and she showed Dobbs how to read the soil for where the ground was hardest, so the root crop could do the breaking instead of the plow. Harlan came back before the legumes had even sprouted, and this time he came with words aimed past Remington and straight at the crew. He leaned on the corral and spoke loud enough for the whole yard to hear, playing on the only suspicion he had left to work with. He used her foreignness and the strangeness of betting a whole ranch on a garden trick nobody in the territory had heard of. He called her the Chinawoman the way Webb's men had called her, the wrong name used as a weapon, and he asked the crew how it felt to put their wages behind a stranger nobody could place on a map. It was the historical ignorance of the frontier turned to a purpose, and the purpose was to split the crew from her before the legumes could prove her right. The men in the yard went still, the way they go still when a thing is being said that they will have to pick a side on. She didn't argue with him, and she didn't explain herself, and the silence she answered him with wasn't submission, but the kind of calm that only comes from having already accepted the worst possible outcome. Webb was the one who answered, quiet and flat and in front of every man in the yard. He told Harlan that the crew had eaten her food and worked her field, and that the Bar R wasn't for sale at any number a man on a polished horse would carry. It was the first public loyalty any of them had shown her, and it came from the last man who would have offered it a month before, and Harlan rode off with the same easy seat and a harder face. The bet was visible now, and the whole ranch was riding on it, and the weather gave them the first test of it before Harlan could even get home. A late heat wave rolled in and sat on the young legumes like a hand pressing on a chest, and the leaves started to curl by the second afternoon, the kind of heat that can kill a planting in a day if a man lets it. She rigged shade across the rows with the canvas from an old wagon cover and ran water through the ditch in a slow trickle through the worst of the afternoon. She stayed out in it until the sun dropped and the heat broke and the leaves uncurled in the cool of the evening, and the crew watched her do it and added it to the list of things she knew that they didn't. Remington found her at dusk, sitting on the ditch bank with her hands in the cool water. He sat down beside her without a word and let the silence hold, because some nights the only honest thing a man can offer a person who is saving his land is the company of sitting there while she rests. The planting held, and for one quiet evening it looked like the worst of it was behind them, though the worst of it wasn't behind them at all, and was in fact already coming down out of the north. The weather broke the wrong way 3 weeks later, and the sky over the basin turned the color of a bruise and started to move. A hard early storm came down out of the north, with wind and a cold that had no business in that month. The kind of cold that can wipe a young crop in a single night and turn a whole season of bedding into nothing. This was the wall they had been racing, and it had arrived early, and the whole ranch was up before dark working against it, the lanterns lit and flickering amber along the rows as the wind kicked the flames sideways. They worked the legume field through the failing light, laying canvas and straw over the rows the way she had shaded them in the heat, banking the storage against the cold and piling straw over the root crop by the creek. She ran between the rows with the men, and the wind hit, and a section of canvas tore free and snapped across the field. The young hand went after it, and came back with it and a face full of driven rain, and they pinned it down again with stones and fence posts and the weight of their own bodies in the dark. The cold came down after the wind, a true frost out of season, and they worked until they couldn't feel their hands, and then they worked a while longer, because a season of bedding doesn't let you stop just because your hands have gone numb. At first light, she walked the field alone, and what she found was the cost of the night written in the crop. A section at the east edge blackened where the canvas had torn and the frost had gotten through, gone and not coming back. Webb stood at the fence and watched her face and read it the way he had learned to read her, and what he saw wasn't ruin but the arithmetic of what was left. Most of it had held under the straw. Enough of it had survived. She came back to the fence with her hands raw and red from the cold and said nothing, because nothing was the truest thing she could have said. Remington had his own choice to make that morning: take Harlan's money now and walk away whole, or trust the rest of the season to a woman he had known one summer. He looked at the green that was still standing and at her and chose to stay. The choosing was the first thing he had done in a long time that felt like the man his father had hoped he would be, instead of the man the ranch had been making him. Weeks passed, and the fields answered, slow at first, and then all at once, the way land does when it has been given back something it needed. The legumes stood green and thick in the south field where the corn had starved, their roots noduled with the nitrogen they had pulled out of the air and fixed into the dirt, and the soil under them was darker than it had been in years. The root crops broke the hardpan by the creek and pushed up fat and clean, and the rested field, the one she had fenced off and left alone, was already softening on top, the kind of recovery that happens only when you stop taking and let the ground breathe. The crew walked the rows at the end of that week and saw what they had helped plant come back as food, and the look on their faces was the look of men who had been given proof that the bet they made had been the right one. They ate from their own land for the first time in longer than any of them wanted to count, and the meal was her egg-crease sushi made with the vegetables they had grown themselves. The same dish that had won their mouths the first day now fed them out of soil she had healed. The food as love language circle closed on itself that evening, the rolls golden on the plate, and the men quiet over them for a different reason than the first time. It wasn't surprise this time, but the settled knowledge that the hands that rolled these had also kept them alive through a winter they hadn't believed they would see. Harlan rode up one last time and looked at the south field and at the root crop and at the crew standing easy in the yard. He turned his polished horse without making an offer and rode back the way he had come, and the rival threat closed like a door that wouldn't open again. Remington walked the field with her at the end of the day, the light going long and gold across the green, and he carried nothing and said little, and the silence was already full. The land wasn't what it had been before his father broke it, and it might never be, but it was alive again, and the proof of it was under their boots and in the air, and in the fact that there would be a next season at all. She walked beside him with the lacquered box under her arm, closed again, and the weight of it was different now, lighter, the weight of a thing that has found the place it was carried to. He found her in the kitchen that evening, the lacquered box open on the table, and her grandmother's measures and knife laid out in the amber lantern light, and she was sorting the last of the seed for the spring. He didn't make a speech, because the voice of this story doesn't allow a man to talk his way past a turning point. And he didn't need to. He set a cup of tea down on the table beside the box. A small thing, the kind of gesture that does the work of a whole speech if the person it's meant for can read it. Then he said her name and asked her one line, whether she would stay past the season and stay as his wife. She didn't answer with words right away, and the pause wasn't hesitation, but the same stillness she had shown over the seaweed and over the storm, the calm of a person who has already accepted the worst and is now being offered something better than she planned for. Then she set the seed down and folded the cloth over it and looked at him. And what she did, the small, steady thing she did with her hands, was the answer. He read it the way he had learned to read her, by what she did rather than by what she said. It wasn't love yet, not even trust yet, but the recognition that had passed between them in the doorway that first evening, grown through a summer of dirt and egg crepes and a frost that almost took everything, into something that could hold the weight of a name. The marriage wouldn't be neat, because nothing in that country was, and she would still be a stranger to every town within a day's ride, a Japanese woman in a place that couldn't tell one kind of foreign from another and mostly didn't try. He would still be a man one bad season from the same ruin he had been staring at when she walked up the road, and the banknote was paid, but the next one was already forming on the horizon the way storms do. They chose each other anyway, in the kitchen, in the lamplight, with the seed for the spring laid out between them, because two people who have stood alone against forces stronger than themselves know exactly what it costs and exactly what it is worth. The lacquered box sat closed on the kitchen shelf that night, on a shelf that was hers now, her grandmother's measures resting beside it in the dark. The road she had walked in on was still out there beyond the porch, and so was the next hard season, and she knew it, and she stayed. Drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels, and if it moved you, hit that like button.